When you get real and get honest and you face God and face your partner, something beautiful starts to happen. You start to introduce grace.
It's so amazing how God gives you more blessings than you can even imagine when you do His will.
When they start looking through that lens of the atonement through the life experiences, it doesn't change how hard that experience is, but it changes how they process it, and then it allows them to grow from it.
Hello and welcome to Latter-day Profiles. I'm Brian Howard here in St. George, Utah, and joining me today is Waldo Galan. Waldo, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian.
Such a pleasure to have you. I got introduced to you through a mutual friend. Waldo, you've been involved in so many things in Ford Motor Company and executive, doing so many positions over the years, all over the world, Brazil, Japan, the Middle East. Currently, right now, you're the president of Waldo D. Galan and Associates, an automotive consultant based in Cedar City. But such a pleasure to have you here. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I was doing some research, found out originally your family's from Cuba, correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that and how you ended up here in the U.S.
Well, my parents were born in Cuba. My family was raised there. I was actually born in Venezuela. My father had some businesses going on over there in the 50s, early mid 50s. So I was born in Venezuela, and then in 1959 we migrated back to Cuba when I was about 3.5 years old. So we were in Cuba until 1967. Of course, the whole revolution, democracy, not democracy, and then what it turned out to be, it was an experience that my parents decided was not for them. And it certainly wouldn't allow us as children to grow into whatever we could be. That was always foremost in their minds. So we went through the missile crisis and the Bay of Pigs and all the shortages and rationings and some persecution. But we were able to get out in '67, and we went through Mexico. We had some family there, my great aunt and great uncle that migrated from Spain originally back in the early 1900s. And they took care of us for a year until we got all our paperwork done, and then we came into the U.S. and it was quite an ordeal. My oldest brother had to be sent out of Cuba first, so he wouldn't be called into the military. Oh. So anyway, we were separated for almost 2 years, and then we were reunited in New Mexico, and eventually made our way to California, where we lived for a few years. So,
at what point did you get introduced to the gospel? What did that happen?
Well, in high school, on and on, I had friends. I played basketball in high school, and I had friends that were members of the church, and they would invite me to play ball in the gyms. Sure. Back then, it was very competitive basketball. Yes, if you'll remember, I remember walking into this ward building with a huge trophy case in the foyer. So, but it was really after high school and that my relationship with them got a little stronger. My wife, who was my high school sweetheart, she was also investigating on her own. She graduated a year before me from high school. And then we had this two-pronged front, right? My friends, the basketball, the sports, and then Kay at the college and institute and so forth. So she was baptized before I was, and then it took me probably about 8 or 9 months to kind of figure out the things that I could figure out at that time about the gospel, and it just rang true. And eventually I was baptized and became a member of the church. So,
At what point, I know you went to Cerritos College.
Right.
What were you studying?
Well, just general ed. I have to admit, I was not the best student in the world. I played sports, and that was what I focused my life on. And it was, I would have settled down eventually, I think, in terms of my university career. But my father, interestingly enough, after many years of trying the American dream, one day said, this just isn't for us. I cannot provide for your mother here the way that I could back in Latin America. I mean, he had owned several businesses and had done very well before we went to Cuba. So he asked us to go with him and help him get settled. And after that, we could go on our way. And since both of them sacrificed so much for us, it was a no-brainer for my brother and I and my sister, who was younger. My sister was younger than I. So we went to Venezuela in 1974, and kind of towards the end of the year. And I worked and helped and as much as I could. And then in 75, a year and 2 months after I was baptized, came back and married my wife in the LA temple. So it was marvelous. A poor little thing. She had always lived in California, and 2 weeks after we were married, she's got 2 bags, and we're on our way to South America again. So, and that was the beginning of a long journey, if you would.
I would say, yeah, you in Venezuela, when did you involve with, it was Ford Motor Company originally, right?
Right.
How did that happen?
Well, it was kind of interesting. The first time that we lived in Venezuela, right after we got married, I went to work for a company called Container Corporation of America. It had nothing to do with cars, but they were really good in training and instructing and teaching. So I was like a sponge, I wanted to succeed, and I learned as much as possible. We came back to the U.S. for about 1.5 years, and then a person that I had worked with at Container called me up and said, "Hey, I'm at Ford now. We need people like you down here, and here's what we'll offer you." And so we talked about it, packed our stuff, and went back. So I started with Ford in 1978. I was in the parts and service department, and then from there, quickly went into the sales of automobiles, running dealerships, the whole dealer network in Venezuela. So I did well until the economy tanked. So, yeah.
What was living conditions, living in Venezuela, for those of us not familiar with it? At that point, what was life like?
Well, at that point, life was great. Venezuela was, up until that point, a kind of a struggling democracy, but it was a democracy, and you could do well if you worked hard and if you focused. There were other avenues of making wealth, but we obviously stayed away from those. But it was a great living. It wasn't unsafe to begin with. So we had 2 of our 4 children there, and it was great. But then, as everything that is poorly run, the country went into a terrible devaluation, literally overnight, and the currency, it was worthless. We went home on a Friday night with the exchange rate being 4.3 bolivares to $1. And on Monday morning at 9 a.m., it was 16 bolivares to $1, and it just kept going down the drain. So it became unsustainable for those of us that lived there but had a foothold in the U.S. So I left Ford for about 18 months and then came back in 85. And then the rest, I couldn't have asked for a more rewarding career. I worked in the international group. We had the opportunity to live in Japan. We lived on and off for 10 years in Detroit. It looked like their stomach for me in Detroit only lasted about 18 months, and then they would send us somewhere. So Japan, we were there for 3 years. The Persian Gulf, the first Persian Gulf War came into play, and they asked me to come back to Detroit to kind of take over the rebuilding of our business right after that in 91. So I worked that from Detroit with a really talented group of people, and we were able to put everything together. We opened an office in Dubai, and we decided, Kay and I, not to take the opportunity to go to Dubai just yet. We had our children were in high school, and we wanted them to. So I stayed in Detroit for a few years, and after that it was Brazil for 3, and then back to Chile. I set up Ford Motor Company Chile, so they asked me to run it from Brazil while I worked as a director of Ford South America on import-export operations. At that time, we owned Jaguar, Land Rover, Volvo. And then we lived in Chile for 3 years, of probably some of the most rewarding years we've ever lived anywhere, especially when it came to the gospel and serving and so forth. And then after that, we came to Detroit for another 18 months, and the last 7 years of our career was 4 in Dubai and then another 3 in Puerto Rico. And that's where, it was time for us to move on to do other things.
Yeah, what a storied career.
Yeah.
As you're moving around all these different places, 2 things culturally with you and your family. It sounds like you had your family in Detroit for quite a while they're going through school. Did you take them around to other places? Did they
Japan, definitely. We were all there. That was a great experience for all the kids. I mean, my oldest boy, he's 47 years old. He's had a full career in the military. He retired a couple of years ago as a lieutenant colonel. And now he started his second career because he's still young. But we still talk about Japan like it was one of the greatest things in his life, and the same with the others. They really cherished that. I think it prepared them a little better for the world. They came back into middle school and high school here in the U.S. And then they've never really been afraid of expanding their horizons. Only our youngest went with us to Brazil and then to Chile. Everybody else was already in college and doing their things.
Tell me about, as you're going through these different places, you had a chance to serve in the gospel. How was it, from place to place? How was it different? How was it the same? How was serving in those different places?
I always think of Elder Uchtdorf and his just absolutely fabulous talk about lift where you stand. Remember that one? He used the example of the piano, right? And that has always been our mentality. We decided early on we will go wherever the company takes us, but our primary goal is to integrate into society, to be a part of society, and then to serve the Lord in whatever capacity. So, both Sister Galan and I have had callings in every continent almost in the world, from branch president to, I've served in 4 bishoprics, 4 stake presidencies. I've been a primary teacher. I've been everything. You just serve. And sometimes it went from the sublime to the ridiculous, right? We were in Chile literally 2 weeks in our home after moving in, and I get this phone call. Why don't you come on in? We're having a stake conference. We need you to come in and be interviewed by some of the leadership. And sure, I dressed. It was on a Saturday, and we were having people from my office that were coming in with their spouses so that we can kind of get to know each other better. And I didn't even know there was a stake conference. That's how new we were in the country. But long story short, after going to the first interview, running home, changing clothes, cooking a barbecue, hanging out with people, and getting the second phone call, a call to be in the stake presidency was extended. And I'm looking at Elder Francisco Viña of the 70 back then. He's emeritus now, but I look at him and I say, Elder Viñas, I don't understand. I literally just got here and I don't know anybody. And he basically smiled and he said, well, the new stake president was outside on the hallway all afternoon as we interviewed everybody. And he said that you were the only brother that walked up to every priesthood holder that was sitting in that hallway waiting and shook hands and introduced yourself to him. I said, well, I'm new. I know nobody. That was a natural thing to do. And he said, well, he liked that, so you're his counselor. So, anyway, and it was a fabulous experience. It was a time of a lot of changes for the church in Chile. Elder Holland had been assigned to Chile by President Hinckley, as well as Elder Oaks to the Philippines, if you recall that. And they were supposed to be there 1 year, and it was extended to 2. So it was just fabulous being almost on a weekly basis in contact with this apostle who had this tremendous responsibility to the people of Chile, the membership, to help them to consolidate and get strengthened. And today, well, now we have several temples there. The membership is growing. It's just fabulous.
Tell me your experience. This one caught my eye. A stake president in Dubai. It seems so unusual, but tell us about that experience.
Well, it's kind of surreal, to be quite frank. And it's not this way anymore, but back then, there was the stake covered 7 countries. So we were recognized as a church in the Kingdom of Bahrain. So that was the kind of the stake center, even though none of us in the stake presidency lived in Bahrain. One of my counselors was in Saudi Arabia in one of the Aramco compounds on the eastern province. And then the other counselor was in Qatar. And then the clerk was in Qatar, the executive secretary was in the Emirate of Sharjah. So it was really difficult. Zoom wasn't doing what it does today back then, so it was hard to have these video conferences. But we even had 14 members in the High Council because we were spread so thin, and we had additional responsibilities with the military groups in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as what we called the Arabian Peninsula branch. There's a lot of land in the Arabian Peninsula in many little cities and towns spread, especially through Saudi Arabia. And members of the church, particularly from the Philippines, would be hired to go do work in these remote areas like nurses and administration and things like that. But they were alone. They were the only members for miles and miles on end. So we called that group that went all the way to Yemen, actually, the Arabian Peninsula branch. And I had a member of the High Council who traveled quite extensively for his work and was able to meet with these folks from time to time. And we wrote to them constantly. And eventually we set up a video conferencing so that they could remotely participate in one of the sacrament meetings in Dubai. And that just made
so much better.
Oh my gosh, it was just tremendous what it did for them and their testimonies.
Technology definitely a benefit on that case when you're
Oh my
separated
gosh,
so far.
it was perfect. It was absolutely perfect. The timing was spot on. So it was surreal as the managing director for Ford Motor Company's business in the Middle East. You can imagine I not only had the 7 countries in the Gulf, but I had all of Levant, I had Israel, Pakistan, and Iraq, Afghanistan. So I was on the road constantly, and most weeks I would come home on Thursday. The holiday is Friday over there, so we met on Fridays at church. And, I would get home, unpack, repack, grab Kay, and go do the Lord's work on Friday and Saturday, and wherever. And, if I wanted to visit, for whatever reason, the Jeddah ward in Saudi Arabia, that was an almost 5-hour plane ride from Dubai. So it's like crossing the United States to go minister to. But it was, we never thought twice about it. It was natural for us to just do what needed to be done for the short period of time that I was the stake president. Elder Holland, when I was called, Kay and I were taking him to the airport. He and Pat, Sister Holland, and we called my daughter. It was her birthday, so we called from the car, and we sang her happy birthday. And she goes, "Who else is in the car?" And I said, "Well, it's Elder Holland and Sister Holland, and we have some news for you." And we told her that I had been called as the stake president, and she goes, "Wait a minute, Elder Holland, does this mean that my dad has to stay in Dubai for many, many years?" And Elder Holland didn't even blink. He said, "Nena," that's my daughter's nickname, "the Lord calls him and Ford Motor Company releases him." So true to his words, a few months later, it was almost a year later, Ford said, "Okay, we're transferring you." And that was the end of that. But I thought that was clever,
What a great experience.
Yeah.
Well, I'm asking now, you moved to Cedar City. Currently, you have a current calling as a patriarch in a YSA ward, which is awesome. Also a sealer in the temple.
Yeah.
Tell us about that experience, especially working with youth, because you also get an opportunity to seal some of those youth that are getting the patriarchal blessings.
It's been amazing. I think every patriarch in the church would tell you that this is probably the scariest assignment that you could possibly receive. It's a calling that's yours throughout your life. You only stop serving when you cannot anymore physically, just like as being a sealer. You go until you just can't, which is in itself a great compliment for a mere mortal like me.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's just been an incredible experience. And, you get to go into a YSA stake, and it's something to behold. We just had a stake conference, and we have one chapel that is actually a stake center, which is actually two massive chapels back to back.
Mm-hmm.
And you sit there towards the front of the building, and on the hour, there's not a place to sit. It's just packed. And you know that every single one of those young women and young men are there because they want to be there, because they have a testimony, because they're seeking after the Lord and His goodness so that their lives can be blessed, so that they can flourish in their careers and their studies. And so some of them, for whatever circumstance, never received their patriarchal blessing at an earlier age. And our bishops are terrific. As soon as the semester starts, they start interviewing, and have you served a mission? Do you have a patriarchal blessing? And then we get cranking, and the curve ramps up very fast. And it's just rewarding what the Lord is revealing for these young men and women in this dispensation at this time for them to do and accomplish. And it takes time to prepare, but I keep thinking of what President Hinckley said to patriarchs back in 2005. He said, you are the vessel for a prophetic, personal revelation for those individuals. And I just pray that I can be up to the task every time I put my hands on one of these kids' heads.
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk with you. What great stories. Thank you so much for taking a few minutes to come and share a little bit of your past.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Waldo.
Yeah, thanks.